Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from our massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, how are you today, man? We're both in the same town at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just us today, by the way. The closest thing we have to a special guest is the power washers that are doing the house right now. And so you may hear my windows getting blasted and all of that here in the office. They just finished, so hopefully it won't be too bad. But if anybody hears a lot of noise in the background, that's what it is, and so we'll call them the special guest this week.
Yeah, we've had lightning, we've had fire trucks, we've had dogs, we've never had power washers. So it's a new wrinkle for the show. That's good. That's good. Hey, since it's just you and me, I was thinking, man, like, do you listen to many podcasts very often? Like you're in the car or you're on the plane or something like that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have a slight addiction to them, and I probably have 10, 15. Subscriptions to various ones, both tech and non-tech. Yeah, and so I'm constantly listening to them without a doubt.
Yeah. So here's my thing. So I listen to a bunch too, and I find that like there's a whole bunch of sponsors that seem to be on every single show. You know, it's like Blue Apron, Tommy John underwear, Movement watches. Like, do you think we should just start doing reads for those guys, and then maybe they'll pick up and
they'll pick us up?
Yeah, they'll just pick us. Yeah, we'll just have our own offer code. It'll be like Blue Apron /Cloudcast for 10% off or something like that.
And then it comes in and they're like, "What the hell is this?"
Exactly. So I think we should just start mixing those in. If anybody has a favorite one, we'll do a read for one of those guys.
There you go.
So you and I have both been traveling a bunch. We've been going to events and shows and different things, and we thought maybe we'd kind of recap some of the stuff. So like I was at KubeCon /CloudNativeCon. I was at DockerCon this week. You were out in Seattle doing this cool thing with the Windows or with the Microsoft Azure people, and then we're going to be at Serverless Conf next week in Austin. So we thought maybe we would like review some stuff and then preview some stuff and give some folks some insight into what we've been working on. Yeah,
absolutely. So why don't we kind of just do it kind of chronological? It would probably be the easiest way to do this. Why don't you get started with your feedback from CloudNativeCon and KubeCon? It looked, I'll give my impression from kind of Twitter following it. It looked like a really good event. Yeah. Really was impressed with kind of the message and the momentum coming out of there. But I, again, that's really doesn't compare to actually being at the event. So why don't you kind of give us the rundown, and I'll hit you up with questions.
Yeah. So show was good. It was in Berlin. So the previous one was in Seattle. About 4 months later, they did the one in Berlin. I want to say, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but like Seattle was like 1,000 people. I think Berlin was about 1,500 people, which is, pretty good.
I was at Seattle. Seattle was a great event. I was thoroughly impressed with it, and compared to, huge growth over the previous time. And then to have 1,200 to 1,500 at an EU event, that's a good attendance.
Right. So good event. Lots of, kind of a good mix of sort of like customers and vendors. So Europe, the European region, I guess, there's lots of different factions in there, but seem to be big adopters of Kubernetes at this point. They seem to have picked up on it early. Lots of government agencies, different types of companies, car companies, government agencies, banks, financial services. So lots of different customers in Europe were there presenting, were around and about. So it was nice that it wasn't just sort of a bunch of vendors talking to other vendors about their cool technologies. So a decent number of use cases, because Kubernetes is getting to a point now where the technology that's in there supports a lot of broad use cases. So it's not sort of just microservices /cloud native apps. You're seeing people put existing applications into Kubernetes and trying to figure out what the new stuff does. So that was all really good. I think in terms of trends from the show, it was a couple things. I think they're seeing a lot of contributions, which is really good. I think they're up over like almost 1,200 contributors at this point to the Kubernetes projects, and there's a whole bunch of them. And then there was kind of a new push that people were like, hey, we've got to figure out how to get create a better user experience, kind of developer experience for people that want to sort of leverage native Kubernetes features and stuff. So instead of just plopping something in a container and putting it into Kubernetes and then, just hoping it scales and does some stuff, there were some good talks about how do you make the user experience / developer experience better?
So I'm going to ask you this then. Then the thing that immediately jumps out at me from all of this, though, is the Kubernetes projects.
Yeah.
And the amount of Kubernetes projects. And
I know where you're going.
I'm going to ask this both positively and negatively.
Yeah.
Is this the next OpenStack?
Yeah. So it's a I know. I knew you were going there. So I think it's a fair question, right? So on one hand, so the reason that comes into play is, there are a bunch of special interest groups for Kubernetes. So there's everything from like apps to networking to storage to security to a bunch of these groups. And whereas in OpenStack you had they were like basically separate projects, right? So I think the one thing is the Kubernetes kind of core architecture team, which is this mix of Google, like hardcore Google sort of former Borg engineers, some Red Hat people, a bunch of people from different places, Deis and other places. Like they very much, there is sort of this like group of people that are sort of making sure that there is a layer of consistency of this, right? So remember with OpenStack, we would have like, different projects who didn't talk to other projects' APIs, or they would create their own APIs. They would create projects that didn't seem like they were in the vein of doing an IaaS project, like they would do a big data project one day, or they'd want to build their own paths. And so I think there's a lot more cohesiveness in terms of thinking about Kubernetes as one architecture, right? So I think that part is good. The other thing is there's less, at least there seems to be less sort of confusion about what they're trying to do. There isn't this whole like, well, one half of the house thinks we're going to replace VMware and the other half thinks we're going to replace AWS, and we're going to kind of go in different directions depending on which vendor leads an individual given project and so forth. The Kubernetes guys seem to be, hey, we're trying to build a container platform that'll run on a bunch of different clouds, and we're kind of over time adding some features that are going to allow kind of a broader set of application patterns. So that's the simplest way to say, like, I understand the parallels, but I don't know that it's as sort of dysfunctional at times that OpenStack got.
Yeah, and it makes perfect sense because and you and I have discussed this both on the podcast and off the podcast. The biggest issue we had with OpenStack is, those that really followed it behind the scenes, is there was so much infighting of the vision of what OpenStack should be.
Yeah.
And that led to then further vendor interests inside the projects and just everyone bumping heads and internal battles that just was so stalled the momentum in the end. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying OpenStack is finished, but I am saying that I think everyone recognizes this far in, they could have gotten a lot further with a much more focused vision and a much more focused path forward. Yep. And so whenever I hear all of those projects, that's the first thing I think of history repeating itself. But it seems like the shared vision, kind of the umbrella over all the projects, is certainly helping in this instance. And so maybe it is a learning from mistakes kind of thing, which is fantastic.
Yeah. The other thing I think, and again, I'm probably a little biased about Kubernetes because it's part of my day job. But the other thing that I think is useful is you have some of the really big cloud providers, i.e. Google, Microsoft, DigitalOcean, some others who run Kubernetes as a production service all the time. So there's a certain amount of like, native operational expertise that goes into these things that I don't know that OpenStack ever really had. I mean, Rackspace was kind of the only one that was really running it in production for a long time. And, so one of the big problems with OpenStack was always like, how do I upgrade this thing? And did they think through this stuff? And so I think that thing is another kind of difference of just kind of how the projects evolve. So
yeah, and it's definitely a matter of like, okay, the operations of everything moved up stack because OpenStack for a lot of times was trying to be like an AWS replacement.
Yeah.
When this wasn't. This is something that's going to run on top of like AWS or some of the other big public clouds. So no, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. The other thing that was kind of interesting, and we talked to a few of them on the show before, but there was the beginnings of sort of a serverless. I don't know what's the best word, but sort of like application pattern type that was presented there. So the folks from Platform 9 were talking about Fission. The folks from Sebastian, who's now over at Bitnami, is talking about kubeless. And so there was some interest, and it'll be interesting to sort of watch and see, and we'll talk about this as we get into the serverless stuff. Like, there are a few different approaches to how to do serverless on top of, or functions as a service on top of Kubernetes. It'll be interesting to see if the Kubernetes community kind of comes together on this to come up with sort of one approach, or if some of these different approaches are trying to differentiate themselves and go their own way. And do they, does a community follow one versus the other? Right now, they're all pretty small in terms of, number of developers that contribute, 15, 20, 5, something like that. So that'll be something I think the CNCF or the Kubernetes community sort of has to work out, because it does potentially offer the ability to have a kind of cloud agnostic way of doing functions as a service. Whether that's a good thing or not, we'll tend to see. Yeah, makes sense. Absolutely. You want to move on? Yeah. So the folks at Microsoft were very nice to invite us. I couldn't go, but they were nice enough to invite us. You went out to Seattle last week, or Redmond, I guess it would be. I got to hang out with the Functions team, the Azure Functions team. So how was that? Yeah. So first of all, full disclaimer. I want to be very upfront about everything. Microsoft paid for my travel, my hotel, everything. But they hosted a number of industry kind of influencers and press and analysts. And there's, I don't know, if I remember correctly, there was about 10 of us there. And it was really the whole idea was they had some for the Azure Functions team, they had some upcoming things coming out, and they wanted to really just help everyone kind of understand Azure Functions in general and serverless in general. And it was really interesting because, a couple things of that. First of all, there's a lot of bloggers and a lot of industry press people. I kind of looked around the room and I was joking with Donnie that I was like, I'm the only one who doesn't do this full time. Like, but it was really interesting in that. So what they really did was that they had Mark Rosanovich. He's now the CTO of Azure Functions. So they kind of moved him over, and he's talking about all of this. And he kind of gave a big talk at the beginning of the day, and then they actually ran us through a bunch of exercises, which is actually really cool to get hands-on stuff. But let me kind of run through the day a little bit more in depth. And so they started off with the day of, your typical, what we learned very quickly, or what I'm starting to learn very quickly, is every time you have a serverless talk, you have to, it's just like the early days of cloud. You have to define, okay, what does cloud mean? Now you have to go, well, what does serverless really mean? I know it's a bad term. And so they had to go, okay, here's our definition of serverless, right? And for them, the most interesting thing I found is because we've been to a few of these now, and if you compare Azure Functions versus OpenWhisk versus Lambda versus some of the others in the industry, oops, shit, hold on. There we go.
Sorry about that. Oh man, sorry, dude. We'll have to edit this out, I guess. Mute. I'm pulling the batteries out right now. It's a cordless. I'm pulling the batteries out. All right, we'll have to cut that out.
Yeah, we'll just leave it in.
Anyway, so if you compare Lambda versus OpenWhisk versus Azure Functions versus Google Cloud Functions, the most interesting thing to me is the language they use. Microsoft was very upfront and very forthcoming of this is event driven. This is trigger based. They didn't necessarily call it serverless more than they had to kind of put it in a bucket, like analysts and press love to do. And so they kind of said, hey, this is serverless, just like the others, but here's all the ways in which it's different. And they had all of their terminology was very developer friendly, very specifically enterprise developer friendly. And their message, more so than any of the others I've seen so far, it felt very real world. And here's the additional problem it solves. It's not necessarily replacing anything else. It's very additive. It's another tool in the developer toolbox. And here's the use cases in which it would fit. And those use cases were very real world. The customer references they used were very well presented. And I kind of stepped back a second and went, why did they really did seem to nail the message. And I'm like, well, okay. This is Microsoft, right? Yeah. If you compare them against Amazon or Google, neither of them are nearly as well known as hitting that enterprise message.
So so give me an example. What sort of resonated with you?
Yeah, so they really talked about one of the big ones, the customer reference use case was it's so funny because I can't remember if Amazon used them specifically or not when Lambda came out, and I can't remember if it was an intentional dig or not, but it was the weather.com. Okay. And it was very much of, hey, a functions-based idea of, okay, somebody wants to go get the weather, right? That's an event-based thing. Somebody goes and gets the weather. That goes out, it checks the weather, it pulls it down, it delivers it to you, and it sits there idle. As opposed to a whole bunch of VMs in an infrastructure just sitting there waiting, polling, constantly in loops, kind of waiting for things. And so there's this drastic reduction in infrastructure that it takes to actually deliver weather reports. And I'm like, oh, yeah, cool. That's easy. I get that, right? And then they had some other use cases that were all along the same lines of like, how do you deliver this trigger-based or event-driven infrastructure? And then they went into the developer tools. And all of the developer tools, of course, is, hey, this is Visual Studio. This is stuff you already know and love if you're a Microsoft developer, right? And so it was very friendly and embracing the developers where they would be. And they had some pretty unique differentiators. They had this idea of the ability to debug and trace and monitor functions using their App Insights product, which is something else others have it, but not nearly as much. And that's why there is a certain number of startups that are doing that space. And then they had this concept of bindings. And bindings was no more than, hey, how do you pull in external things? How do you go talk to other functions, right? And so how do you pull in other ecosystems? And of course, they had all the Microsoft ones. I mean, that's a given. Right. But I was super surprised. There was probably 100 plus. And it was JIRA, it was GitHub, it was Trello, it was Asana. It was I was really surprised at how very startup-y, if you will, or startup company embracing it was. It very much was like, oh, wow, that's a pretty cool little ecosystem. And then there's the last bit was this kind of logic apps. And I'll kind of go through the exercises because I kind of have to lay them all out, all the pieces to pull them all together. This logic apps is think of it as like a visual pipeline for trigger functions. You write an Azure function, then you write another one, and you write another one, and you say, okay, I'm going to get this result from this and pipe it into this, and then I'm going to pipe it into this, and you just create an application, if you will, based off of a pipeline of triggers. Okay, so it's kind of like the Azure, I think they call it, or the AWS step functions. Like it's like a visual tool to link them together. Yep. Okay. Yep. And it's exactly like that. And so it was really nice. And so then they kind of ran us through some exercises in the afternoon of, okay, we're going to go create a step function. And we did. And, of course, you have a bunch of non-coders is the easiest, most pleasant way to put that. And we went through and bloggers. Right, exactly. and we did all that. And we got through it really well. And we did this example of, okay, it's going to go pull through the Twitter API. It's going to go pull in based off of a Twitter search function. It's going to pull in from the stream. And then we actually pumped it into their machine learning. And it was the Cortana, which I hadn't even dealt with before, but you pumped it all into there, and then it kind of did a certain amount of analysis of where in the world that's coming from, what's going on, and kind of did a certain amount of analytics, and then through the logic apps, we built this pipeline where it would pump it into a nice little dashboard for us. And so every 15 seconds it would go poll everything and then kind of throw it up there. And it was, it was a very practical, although, it was a very catchy way to kind of show this trigger stuff popping off. It was pretty cool. I definitely came away from the day, like I went into it. This is probably the biggest thing is, let me be clear. I went into this day knowing nothing about Azure Functions.
Yeah.
Other than a couple blog posts and everything. And I was like, yeah, okay. I've been to the Google Cloud stuff. I understand Lambda pretty well. And I really had no idea what was going on. And I came out of this with a pretty clear picture of, okay, here's what they want to do. Here's how they see their differentiators. Here's how they see what's going on. And, at the end of the day, I felt pretty good about the overall experience. And, we've been to these before and with various levels of success at times. So I was pleasantly surprised by it. And, it was one of those, I was talking to one of the guys at happy hour after it. And it's like, well, do you think this has legs? And it's like, well, it's freaking Microsoft. If anybody can go figure out an enterprise message and go figure out how to make some money off this, it's them.
Yeah. Was it in terms of like, you don't get into a lot of the deep developer stuff, but was it, .NET specific, or was it kind of like Java and .NET or are they targeting it like real-time applications or certain languages?
Yeah,
or was that dug into?
Yeah. So it's right now it's all, it's of course C# and Java. And then we actually played around. There was an experimental Python library. That one isn't necessarily GA, but there's actually, just like the other platforms, there are certain ones that are GA and supported, and there are certain ones that are beta, if you will.
Yeah.
And for them, all of the big platforms were GA, and then they had a whole bunch of other platforms that were beta.
Okay. Cool. So, and did you get the sense? So Mark Russinovich, he used to be, one of the big cloud guys, and he was talking about new stuff. He's been at DockerCon presenting the Docker integration with Windows, and do you get the sense that like this is the whole functions thing is going to be a big deal for Microsoft, or is this going to be, just another set of features that they have to make sure that, they can check all the boxes that all the public clouds are supposed to have? Or, did you get any sense of like how they were hedging it versus all the other stuff that Azure does?
Yeah. So I got the impression from them. So definitely through a combination of Mark presented for probably a good hour. And then they had the PMs for Azure Functions and Logic Apps come up as well. It was really interesting. It felt like a pretty serious investment. They very much understood the nature of the potential disruption of this. And what I mean by that is from a developer standpoint, they very much understood the idea of, if I'm a developer, I don't want to deal with the infrastructure. I want to spend as much time as I can writing differentiated code, and not code that is just, common platform guts.
Yeah.
And they very much saw that and were looking at that from a standpoint of, if I'm a developer, this is where I want to go. And they seem very serious in building a platform that will go embrace that. And I got that, just like I said earlier, I feel like it's, for them at least, it's additive and not competitive in the portfolio.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. Like we've been kind of paying attention to the serverless stuff for a little while. I don't think we jumped on it immediately, but if you sort of look at the big picture of things, it's like, okay, certain initial limitations are getting knocked down, right? So there are more languages that are supported, for Azure Functions, but all the other ones. We're starting to see more sort of native tools to make it easier, right? So it's not just, write some functions and figure out how to glue them together. There's, it kind of starts to fit into a developer pipeline. It fits into developer tools. I don't know if I've totally seen how people are doing it with like CI yet and so forth, but it is interesting to see how fast this is sort of happening. it's interesting that you were saying they're showing how to do debugging and tracing and that stuff, because that's been, I know at least at some of the previous serverless conf shows, people have said like, hey, you thought PaaS was a black box. This is completely a black box. You have no idea how to tune it and what to do. And so it's interesting. I mean, they're very quickly, learning the things of the past, knocking down holes. And so that's very cool. It'll be interesting to see what they have to say here in a couple of weeks and so forth, and then compare them to some of the others now that you have a new baseline of what to look for.
Yep. Agreed. Absolutely. Let's move on.
Okay. What's next?
DockerCon. So DockerCon was this week. And because of all my travel, I actually declined going to DockerCon because I was at Microsoft last week and I'm going to be at Serverless Conf next week and doing a bunch of travel in May. So I was like, you know what? You're going. I'm going to take this one off this year.
Yep.
So tell me about DockerCon, and we'll get into what the hell happened this week.
Well, I think it's kind of becoming a tradition now. So every DockerCon, Solomon gets up there and he makes some announcement that freaks out the community, right? So 3 years ago, 2 years ago, they did the there was the Docker versus Rocket sort of debate that was going on, and so they created the OCI, and it was okay. We're gonna play nice with this other container format, and we're gonna create this independent foundation that's gonna go make that work. And then last year it was, hey, we're going to embed Swarm into the Docker engine, and we didn't tell anybody about this, but we just went ahead and did it. And so the container scheduling world kind of got it had to go through what does this mean? What's going on? And then this year. And we've had a couple of podcasts on this. One was weird. I did this sort of long, monologue about, what does it mean to deal with Docker community versus Docker the company. And then me and Kelsey Hightower talked about it. And Kelsey kind of led a lot of this, where the big thing in the Docker community was people struggled with, where does capital D Docker Incorporated stop? And where does little d Docker, the open community project, start, right? Or where does one stop and where does one end? Because what was going on was, Docker cranks stuff out really fast, and they make lots of features, and they're doing stuff really fast. And you had certain people in the community who were saying, well, this is boring, low-level container stuff, like it needs to start getting stable. And Solomon was like, well, no, I don't want it to, it doesn't need to be stable. I need to go fast. I need to differentiate my business. And it became this whole like, well, dude, where does your business stop and the community start? Right. So it's a fair argument. Right. It's not Docker specific. It's happened all the way back to, Linux and all sorts of projects. Right. So what they did was, and there had been some rumblings about this before, was, Docker's going to, make a clear separation. And so what they did, and I'm going to try and keep this as clean as possible, just in terms of explaining it. They announced this thing called Moby, and Moby, it was the thought before the show, because a lot of us sort of had heard about it, was that Moby was just going to be the community version, the renamed, rebranded community version of what used to be, /Docker in GitHub. And that's kind of it. So they did make this separation between everything that is now called Docker is only Docker Inc., right? So they want to own the brand. They want Docker to be the commercial way of explaining, which makes total sense, right? It's your brand. You want to own it for go-to-market.
It's their way of solving the big D Docker versus little d Docker problem.
Right. Right. Now, it's tricky because you have, 3+ years of people who have third-party products and documentations and trainings and stuff that reference this Docker thing, and nobody's consistent about, is it big D or little d, because they didn't always know the difference. But what's interesting is the Moby project isn't exactly what Docker was or is. Like, they did this thing, and it's going to take a while for people to kind of unravel it, and so I'm not going to make a lot of commentary on it. But they basically said, well, we've been going, Docker has been going through this process of kind of disaggregating Docker into lots of different pieces, so you have things like container D and run C and these low-level kind of runtime things and image formats and so forth. And so Moby is not just the renaming of Docker, it's kind of this big disaggregation of what people used to know the Docker project to be. Mm-hmm. So the net of that is it's going to take a while for people to figure out, okay, what's in there, what's not in there, because, and I put a link in the show notes, there's this super long pull request that Solomon explains this stuff, and then there's, literally hundreds and hundreds of comments from people. But they make some comments like, well, we're not going to include the CLI in Moby. We're not going to include the SDK in Moby. There are some other things that we're not going to do in Moby that are now going to be in this other project. Some of them are going to stay in Docker. Some of them will be in the community. And so I think there's going to be a period of people trying to figure out, like, okay, what's still named Docker? What's now in Moby? They didn't put the CLI in there. So, people thought there would be things like, well, Docker run will now become Moby run. And it's like, well, we haven't really gotten around to that yet. Right. And when you do stuff like that, as unfortunately Docker has done in the past, where they kind of announce it, but the code's not ready, then, you create all sorts of people going, look, whoa, what are you doing? Right.
Right.
So that was a big deal from an open source perspective. They did that. And then they announced this other thing called...
And let me just add this too. Let's be really honest for a second too. The amount of people in the open source ecosystem versus paying for the big D is a lot more. And so what they effectively did there is they disrupted their own community pretty hard. Now, it is at least in my opinion, outside looking in, there was a little bit of what the hell just happened going on for a while there. But I think what they're doing is it is a certain amount of ripping off the Band-Aid, short-term pain for long-term gain that they probably needed to do.
Yeah. This should have happened, multiple years ago when the thing started to gain some momentum. Look, Docker Incorporated, has a mission to go make money. They've got venture capitalist money and investors and all this stuff. And cool, like they're like every company. They're trying to make money. I think what the community is struggling with is every time Docker says they're going to do this thing, number one, they don't communicate it very far in advance, which is unfortunate. And number two, they now sort of have this track record of, well, we're gonna put something back into the community or change the way it was before, and it's not really the way it was before. So like, the OCI stuff wasn't the complete code. For, and they made it out like, oh, it's going to be the complete code. We're donating everything. And then, this is when Kelsey raised his big stink about like, whoa, dude, you didn't give us all the code. You just gave us the image format. Right. And then, Containerd, when I was at KubeCon, the folks presenting about Containerd, which was donated to CNCF, it was kind of the runtime. They were like, well, it's only on version 0.2. It's not complete. We've scoped it. We've made the scope really small. It doesn't include networking. It doesn't include how you attach to a registry. We're going to kind of hurry up and get it to 1.0, and then it's on the community to figure out where to go with it. And it's like, okay, I think people thought like you were making a donation of the whole thing, and it wasn't. And now you have Moby, which is, not the previous Docker. It's this new, hey, it's a kit to build stuff for builders and other things. And, so I think that's the frustration people have is it's like, it's communication and then it's, well, what's there and what was versus what was the expectation of what was coming. Right. And people can, comment and have opinions on that all they want. But, I think it's going to take a while for people to dig into this code, see what it is. And even the folks from Docker, Solomon and others have said, well, there's probably a lot of other stuff that we need to release as well, but we haven't worked out the nuances and the politics and the details and how it'll be maintained. And but the net is going forward. When you say Docker, you're now supposed to only mean the commercial thing, and when you say the open source thing, it's supposed to be called made by Moby or comes from Moby or something along that. It's this weird trademarky thing. So I'm gonna. We've been going on this for a long time now. I want to kind of move on, but I want to throw in this real quick. I'm just having nightmares of this. This reminds me of when I joined Citrix with CloudStack. Yep.
Because CloudStack was, Cloud.com, which was a closed source product that was bought by Citrix and sold that way, and then they decided to open source it. And then they donated everything to the Apache Foundation, and Cloud Stack became Apache Software Foundation asset and had to go through legal IP and all these other things. And then Citrix then would take Cloud Stack from Apache Software Foundation and turn it into Citrix Cloud Platform.
Right.
Well, no one ever understood that.
Right.
Because the association was already made. Cloud Stack was Citrix.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why it never took off as Apache software. And that feels to me like this all over again of you have multiple years of a name brand.
Yeah. And I'm, I'm gonna refrain from saying anything just because, in my day job we deal with lots of open source projects, and we think there's a good way of doing it, and so I'm going to refrain from
everyone's got an opinion, and of course we have ours, but I'll say mine and you can withhold yours. How's
yes that? There you go. So cool. So there was a couple of other projects and announcements. We'll let that go. If people want to go look at it, there's one called Linux Kit. They donated the containerd stuff, but the other half of the show was basically, hey, look how enterprisey we are, right? So big partnership announcement, obviously with Microsoft, doing Windows containers, or it was like the last time it was Linux containers, and now it's Linux applications that run in Windows containers.
Yes.
Which is, or right. No, let's see, Linux applications in Linux containers running on Windows server, right? Yep. So it's, so again, and this goes back to this sort of Linux Kit, which is like a shim of what a Linux subsystem looks like that you can run in different places. And the net of it is, you can do more stuff with Windows, or with Microsoft, which is good for them. And then the other one, which for anybody that's got virtualization background, this is going to give you hives and a rash. Hey, Oracle is now supported in containers. And
I couldn't wait for you to bring this up.
And guess what that means? You need to figure out where to license your Oracle stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So anybody who deals with Swarm or Kubernetes or any of these orchestration schedulers, you now need to learn things like affinity and affinity groups and non-affinity groups. And how do I make sure that application doesn't run on a core that's not been licensed unless you want to have a humongous bill at the end of the quarter or month or whenever you get charged?
Yeah, I was speechless at the Oracle stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. Great. You can now run Oracle.
Right.
But there was such I just kind of went, huh, especially for the VMware people, everyone who's a virtualization person went, wow, okay, we saw this one, and, Oracle threw everyone under the bus on that one. So my immediate thing was like, yeah, I don't trust them at all.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter that the tech allowed you to do this and that it's actually maybe sort of supported, because that was the other big thing with VMware was you could do it, but it was never supported by Oracle. And so I immediately go, well, is it supported? And oh my gosh, how the hell am I ever going to pay for it? And it just seems so non-Docker.
Hey, guess what? They announced that it was free for dev and test. And you know what the pricing is? We didn't tell you. We're not going to tell you. So, take that with a grain of salt. But lots of enterprisey stuff. They had a bunch of customers, or a few customers, who were like, hey, we're not doing 12-factor microservices apps. We've put, kind of existing applications into containers. And it's like, oh, okay, well, other people have been doing that for a while. But it's, I think, from the perspective of, Docker, they're, sort of now saying, hey, you can do more than that in containers, which, is good for the industry, because now it's like, okay, it doesn't restrict what containers can do to just, the small number of cloud native applications that any one company can build. So that part was good.
It's a common theme we've seen over and over again on the show over the years of, new company comes out, new company gets a bunch of traction, new company gets a bunch of early adopters and early customers with a very specific use case. New company realizes they need to make more money. New company realizes I need to go after the enterprise. New company then realizes I can't do that with these existing new and evolving use cases. I need to go do boring stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you and I have said this a million times. I think we may need to we're going to become startup consultants. Step 1, have a big idea, think you're going to go change the world, only work on new stuff. Step 3, okay, you have now taken more rounds of funding and you have to go after the enterprise. Okay, that's the way this game works. Like that's where the money is. Rinse, repeat, new startup. Let's say you're going back after the enterprise. So yeah, we've heard this game before.
We're becoming cynical in our old age.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, so I think that sort of wraps up the shows. I mean, DockerCon was good. 5,000 people or something like that. It felt like about the same as the Seattle one, but they said it was bigger. Okay, cool. It's hard to tell between different venues, but 4,000 or 5,000 people. So you and I are going to be back in Austin next week, or I'm going to be back in Austin. You're going to be in Austin. So what are we expecting from the serverless show, the serverless conf?
That's a great question. More so than anything for me, I'm always interested in what are the use cases.
Yep.
And I've been following the other ones, and so this is third, fourth big one.
Yeah.
Haven't been to any of them yet. So actually, more than anything, I'm just looking forward to kind of the vibe, because it's definitely on the smaller side still. So it's nice to go to one of these smaller conferences for a change. And the idea here is really in depth talking to everyone. I of course want to talk to the big four, Google, IBM. AWS and Microsoft. I definitely want to figure out what their deal is, but I really also more so want to get out what are the evolving customers, what are the evolving startups, what are the folks that are filling the gaps that the big four aren't necessarily doing right now. That's the big thing for me, is I'm always looking for the gaps and who's filling the gaps or who's not.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm looking for. Well, you're right. So meet the community, get to know the community. That's always a big one for me. There's three things. One is it more than just the vendors? So we always want to see our customers showing up. That's always an important thing. The second one is can you and I walk away from this and go, I have a pretty good sense of what's different between Google Functions, Azure Functions, Lambda, whatever else, all these other ones. So we have some sense of people going like, are they all basically the same? It just depends on who which vendor you pick, or is there really some unique differences that will, impact how you build an application? And then the third one is trying to figure out like, does serverless become the paradigm that forces, that you're only going to use the public cloud? Or is there going to be some sort of cloud agnostic thing that comes along, right? Is that one of these Kubernetes ones? Is it this serverless framework that everybody talks about that sort of acts, kind of makes it agnostic? What is that? Because if serverless does become a big thing and it only runs in the public cloud and it is sort of tied to a specific cloud, does that impact its growth? Does that drive its growth? Those types of things. So those are kind of the big three things I'm looking forward to. Plus I found a couple of good hidden barbecue places that we can go check out.
Nice. Fantastic. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to next week. For me, this is definitely the show that I'm looking forward to learn the most.
Yeah.
Because it is for us, relatively new ecosystem that we're kind of learning and digging into and sharing with the listeners, and so I'm really looking forward to it as well.
Yep. So we're gonna take the microphones. I think we're gonna try and do a few shows down there. We may just do a bunch of like introduce you to the community kind of shows, maybe not super in depth, but we'll see what we have time for and quiet space for and all those good things. But we're gonna record a few from down there. I think that's the plan at least.
Yep.
So, well, cool. You want to wrap it up so we can go home and get ready for Austin?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a good bit this week. Seems like our longer shows are the ones when it's just us. We should probably look into that someday.
I know. That's a problem.
Maybe it's just because we don't plan them as much.
Yeah.
So on behalf of Brian and I, thank you very much for listening this week, and thanks for kind of listening to us ramble on for this recap show. But I think it was good, and we'll have we already have a really interesting guest lined up for next week in the AI space. So we'll have an AI show next week, and then look for serverless conference shows probably starting the week after that, and we'll pump out a couple of weeks for the next couple of weeks. So you may actually not hear a new show from us for a couple of weeks. You just might hear serverless conference for, I don't know, 2 weeks or so.
Yeah.
So just kind of give everyone a heads up of what's coming. But certainly, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.